Hello, good morning. So today I'll be discussing to you regarding regression and correlation. As we all know in the one that I uploaded to you, the module 2, that regression is one of the data science tasks. Is actually one of the methodology or method under data science. So again, we have classification, we have regression, we have data mining, we have neural networks and so many other things. So what I am going to discuss to you is the most common method or the most common task uh, that we are using or that computer science studies are using. So my first method or the first data science task that I'm going to present to you or to discuss to you is about regression analysis or regression and correlation. Okay, so I will be uploading this presentation to you later after I recorded this video. Okay, so before we go further with what is regression analysis, these are the things that I'm hoping that you will be able to learn or that you will be able to understand at the end of this video discussion. So we have to understand regression analysis. So as we all know, regression analysis or regression type of method or methodology is very important because there's a lot of studies that is actually effective when you use regression. And then we also have to compute and interpret the results of bivrate regressions and multivibrate regressions. So these are the types of regressions. And then we also have to compute and interpret correlation analysis. So there are examples at the end of this almost at the end of this presentation. There are examples for you to be able to understand the real data scenario of what is regression analysis or regression and correlation. Okay, so the concept, but before that, we I will discuss to you the theory or the concept of regression so that you will understand w- where thus regression analysis coming from. Okay, so regression technique is used to assess the strength of a relationship between one dependent and independent variables. I know you're quite familiar already with dependent and independent variables, so I'm hoping you are quite familiar. Well, later on, I will be giving you some example of what is dependent and independent variable. So again, regression deals with the relationship with one dependent and independent variables. It could be two, four, or five, as many as you can independent variables. Now, it also helps in predicting the value of a dependent variable from one or more independent variable. By the way, do you know what is a variable? I hope that you will know what is a variable because these terms will be used many times. So, variable is actually, I'm gonna write it in the I'm gonna write it here so that you will know what is variable. So when you say variable, so this is what is a variable mean. A variable is an element, a feature, it could be a factors that mm, liable to vary or change. So let's say for example, what are the uh, example of variable? So we have variable ha. These are the factors that actually uh, actually realize your study. So example of variable, we have again factors that liable to change. So it's changeable. It varies from many types of factors. So we have age. It could be vary. We have the age. We have the sex. We have the let's say uh, amount of sleep. Amount of sleep. We have uh, gender is gen, gender is also one example of variable. So there are a lot of examples of variables. So these are the most common variable, which is it deals with the profile of a person or a things or an elements. So it's the example is the age, sex, amount, or sleep. Now we will continue. Regression analysis helps in predicting how much variance is being accounted in a single response. So when you see variance, uh, variance deals with statistics. It's a lot of statistics. So if you know what is variance means, variance is actually the measure of variability. So it's actually the measure of variability. So when we see variance is actually, I'm trying to uh, dissect everything so that you will know what this really is all about, because it's important for you to know the terms or the terminologies involved when it comes to regression analysis. So we have the variance. Variance is actually a measure. We have a measure of variability. So when we say variance, it involves mean. You know what's mean? Mean is actually the average of the given number number and is calculate by dividing the sum. So let's say for example, before getting the variance manggod, you have to get the mean of the whatever given number there is. So let's say for example, uh, age. So we have 46. Let's say for example lang 45 and for 57. So the total of that will be how much? So it is, so kung i-add na to, we have the calculator. Calculator na lang ta para mas dali. So we have 46 plus 45 plus 57 equals divided by the number of the sum divided by how many is the given number. So we have divided by 3. So we have 49.33. So this is the mean. Mo na siya ang mean. So also variance involve deviation. You know what's deviation? Deviation is actually a deviation from the mean. So let's say for example, when we say deviation, ato na lang ni siya i-discuss one by one so that you will know. It's actually uh, deviation from the mean. So when you say deviation from the mean, so si 46, i-minus na to kang 49.33. So what is that? The answer with that will be the deviation. 45 minus 49.33, no, 49.33, and so on and so forth, okay? So that's the standard deviation or the deviation from the mean. Now, in order for us to get the variance, we have to solve the mean, we have to solve the deviation, and then we have to solve the square deviation. So when you say square deviation, what's the purpose of the square division, by the way? Now, the purpose of the square division is for us to multiply each deviation multiply each deviation as to have the result of a positive number or positive output. Positive number or output. Okay, if you look at this number here, output. If you look at this number here, manggod, this will result in a negative, right? Kani, mo negative man ni siya. Because kung ato ni siyang isolve using this one, this will result in a negative sign. So we have 45 minus 49.33. So kung i-minus nato si 45 minus 49, it will be negative 4.33. That's why we need 2 squared. So kung mag-example tag square diri, so it will be negative 4.33, because squared man nato, it will be to the power of tamaning 2 diri. 2, or let's say, Wait a minute. Basta, squared na nato siya times 4.33. So the total of that will be the squared. So again, in order for us to get the variance, we need to solve the mean, the deviation, the squared. And then finally, we need to we need to sum the square. So whatever the results, diri tanan, whatever the results, there is a deviation, you have to add everything. So we have the sum of squares. From here, sum of squares, we have to add everything and divide this by the number of n, which is equals to 3. 1, 2, 3. Anyway, this is not really, I will not give this an exam. I just want to uh, explain how to get the variance, because variance is really what makes the regression analysis, in order for you to understand what really a regression analysis, it is actually to helps in analyzing or how much the variance is being accounted in a single response. So there are two types or two kinds of regression. We have the bivariate regression, and we also have the multivariate regression. So when you see bivariate regression, it actually similar to bivariate correlation. So because both are designed for situation are in which there are just two variables. So again, variables, what do you mean by variables? Variables is an element or features or factors that varies or that liable to vary or change. So it could be you have two variables. We have the independent variables and then the dependent variables. Now, on the other hand, we also have the multiple regression. So when you say multiple regression, this was created for cases in which there are three or more variables. So see, vibrate regression, there are just two variables that is involved, whereas in multiple regression or the multi-vibrate regression, this was created for cases that involves three or more variables. So there are different kind of regressions like correlations, since they are utilized to evaluate the relationship among variables. Evaluate the relationship of the variables because uh, we have to actually the independent variables, whatever happened with the independent variables, it will reflect sa dependent variables. Now later on you will understand what is that all about. So this may you think that regression is another way to measure correlation. However, there are differences in correlation and regression and their purpose, labeling or variable that the kind of inferential test applied. So what do you mean by inferential? So inferential is actually, wait, inferential later I will be discuss what is inferential, but first I will a little bit a quick discussion of what is independent variable before we proceed to the next slide. So when we see dependent variable, I actually type it here already. So when you see independent variable, the cause, this is the cause. Its value is independent of other variables in your study. So when you say independent variables, these are actually what is the cause of the study, and then dili siya magsalig sa other variables within your study. So these are independent. We call it independent because they can actually stand on their own. So dili siya affected with any other variables in your study. However, the dependent variable is the effect. So whatever the cause, ang effect niya, ang outcome niya will be the dependent variable. So whatever changes or whatever varies in your independent variable, it will be the output will be affected in the dependent variable. So that's why it's the effect. Its value depends on the changes of independent variable. So what do you mean by this? So we have this example. Kani. Let's say for example here. Uh, in a study to determine whether how long a student sleeps affects test. Wait lang. So in a study to determine whether how long a student sleeps affects test scores. So in a study daw, uh, how long ang estudyante mo tulog, it will affect the scores of whatever exam he is taking. So the independent variable is the length of time spent sleeping, while the dependent variable is the test score. So if matulog mo the whole day or the whole night before the exam or before the day of the exam, or natulog mo half the night before the day of the exam, it actually affects the scores that you will be getting. So again, ang independent variable nato diha is how long you sleep. That will be your independent variable, because it is actually, it can stand on its own. Depende lang na sa inyo whatever the amount of sleep you are getting. However, ang test score ninyo, it will affect kung natulog ra ba mo or nagtuon mo, or if you are cramming or not. So it will affect your score during that day as well. Okay? Another example also is about the relationship between independent and dependent variable is actually, if you know, okay, if you know, if you want to know whether the caffeine affects your appetite, the presence or the absence of a given amount would be the independent variable. How hungry you are would be the dependent variable. So if you want to know whether ang kape or any drinks or food that has caffeine on it, makaapektar siya sa imong paggana sa kaon. Okay? So, ang presence, it's either sige kag kaon or absence of amount of caffeine or wala ka ni kaon, that will be your independent variable. Mo na imong independent variable. However, depende sa imong gikaon or depende sa amount nga imuhang gi-intake with the caffeine will definitely affect your dependent variable. Mo result siya depende sa amount of whatever given amount of caffeine you are taking. So diha magdepende ang result sa imong dependent variable. Now, how hungry you are would be your dependent variable. Okay? So that would be for the independent and dependent variable. Now, going back to the concept of regression, which involve a lot of things. So we have the difference between correlation and regression. So when you say correlation, we have the characteristic, the purpose of technique. So we call correlation and regression a type of technique. And we also have the labels attached and then the inferential test. So when we say correlation, when it comes to purpose of technique, it is mostly on the association and connection between two variables. Association and connection between two variables. Whereas when it comes to regression, it is the understanding link that is prediction and explanation. That's why we have independent and dependent variable, because we are going to predict what will happen to the dependent variable when our independent variable changes or varies. So it explains how. Now, labels attached. When you have the correlation, there's no clear labels when it comes to the technique in correlation. However, with the regression, as we all know earlier, that there is a clear distinction of what is the dependent variable in your study and what is the independent variable of your study. So naadjud siya difference or distinct, meaning to say klaro, clear nga this is the dependent variable and these are your independent variable. Okay? So when you say inferential test, you also have the correlation coefficient. So what is coefficient? So kung ingong kagali ka og coefficient, is actually, again, the inferential is actually characterized or by involving conclusion reached on the basis of evidence and uh, reasoning. So see, inferential is actually, when we say inferential, this is actually, so that you will know, ha? So we have inferential is inferential test or whatever study that involves inferential is actually characterized Sakto ba nga spelling? Okay, characterized by or involving on the basis, involving conclusions on the basis of evidence. So what you see is what you get, okay? And reasoning. So when you say inferential test, this is most likely involved nga you get to the point, or you concluded a study based on the evidence. So unsay ebidensya na adiha, and then whatever reasoning there is, that's inferential test. Now when we say coefficient is actually naman tayo na mention diri nga coefficient, no? So when it comes to regression coefficient, correlation coefficient, intercept, t-statistic, and changes in regression coefficient. So we heard a lot of things, or we heard quite a few about what is coefficient. I know some of you knows what is coefficient. Any you know what is coefficient na, but coefficient is actually is a number, is a number used to multiply a variable. So let's say for example, uh, sa to example ani, okay, example, uh, 6z, example 6z. So si variable na to ani, because we all, di ba, I've mentioned earlier that variable is the element or the factors or uh, whatever that liable to change or vary is changeable. So c, kung ato ni siyang i-times, so c times z, because that is actually how it goes. Z is actually our variable. Z is actually the variable, while 6 is actually the coefficient. Coefficient. So that how it goes. So si coefficient is the number used to multiply a variable. So 6 is the coefficient. And by the way, uh, any variable with no number, any variable, this is actually a given already. So any variable with no number, have a coefficient of 1, have a coefficient of 1. So in cases that the variable has no any number on it, automatically the default, the coefficient is 1. Okay? So to continue, that's the difference between correlation and regression. But anyhow, we will actually focusing on the regression. That's why most of my discussion will be pointed on what is regression. Okay, again, so si inferential is characterized by involving conclusion reached on the basis of evidence and reasoning, while coefficient this is more on the a number that is used to multiply a variable. Okay, so to continue, there are some of the regression example. The one that I've actually write on the word earlier is actually example also, but that is more on the example of bivibrate, or we call it simple regression. So it only involves two variable, the independent variable and the dependent variable. So following are some scenarios in which we could use regression analysis. So the marketing manager wants to know if price reduction has any change on increasing sales. So this is actually an uh, example of a regression. When we say uh, the dependent variable, so the independent variable will be the has effect on increasing sales, and then the price reduction will be your dependent variable. And then we also have the marketing manager wants to know if sales is dependent on factors such as advertising spend, number of products introduced, number of sales personnel, etc. So this sales is actually dependent, and then we have multi uh, multivibrate multivibrate uh, regression will be on the how many or how much advertising you put into your sales, the number of products introduced, and the number of sales personnel. So the sales here is actually the dependent variable, whatever the sales, and then the independent variable is the advertising spend, the number of products involved or the number of products introduced, and the number of sales personnel, etc. Now, another example is the HR department wants to predict the efficiency of management trainees based on their academic performance, leadership abilities, IQ level, etc. So, the dependent variable for this is the efficiency of management trainees because this is the effect, whereas the cause or the independent variable that varies or changes, and then whatever changes or varies when it comes to your independent variable, that will directly affect the dependent variable. So we have this one is a multivibrate regression. We have the academic performance, the leadership abilities, the IQ level, etc. We could say that this is independent variable because it varies from people. It varies from person involved when it comes to their academic performance. Let's say, for example, uh, uh, Philip has high academic performance, while John will be have a minimum academic performance, and then diri na mo vary ang kadtong kinahanglan mo mag-survey, kinahanglan mo mag-data mine in order for you to know what varies when it comes to this variable. And then another example is a social activist wants to know if increasing female literacy has any impact in increasing the age of marriage of the girl child. Again, a social activist wants to know if increasing female literacy has any effect in increasing the age of marriage of the girl child. So the that will be your assignment. It's easy for you to determine whether if it is an independent or dependent variable. I just want you to think more, and then when we meet next time, I want you to ask which of these can you consider an independent or dependent variable. And then the last one will be how much of the variance in life satisfaction scores can be explained by following set of variables. How much of the variance in life satisfaction scores can be explained by the following set of variables. We have the self-esteem, the optimism, the perceived control. Which of these variable is a better predictor of life satisfaction? So here I want you to identify also which of these are independent variable and which of these uh, that actually the effect of the independent variable, which is a dependent variable. So I want you to comment this on the video with these last two examples with which of these that you can consider as independent and which can you consider as dependent variable. Now, to continue, we have to discuss further about bivibrate regression. The simplest of regression analysis is called bivibrate regression because there are only two variables that are involved. Anyway, you have the copy. I will give the copy of this to you later on, so I don't have to need to explain anything about or any further about this. Now, predicting the value of variable from one or more other variables. So it could be multi-regression or multi-vibrate regression. So a regression analysis is used to predict the value of an independent variable given the values of one or more independent variables by calculating the regression equation. So katong compute na ko ganina when it comes to variance, so naatay mean, naatay square deviation, and then we also have the sum of square divisions, and so on and so forth. Now, uh, we actually have a formula for that so that it will be easier for you to compute. So these are some of the formula which will be directed towards study towards bivibrate regression or which involves two variable only. So the scenario for this will be a marketing manager would like to predict if variation in sales can be explained in terms of variation in advertising expenditure. So this is the bivibrate regression because there are only two variable that is involved. Now, the variation in sales will be your dependent variable, and then the independent variable will be the advertising expenditure. Because the more you put money on your advertising expenditure will somehow directly affect the variation of sales. So let's say for example, if you put a lot of streamers, if you put a lot of kanang advertising on radios or television, it will eventually affect the sales of your company. So since the effect is mo nang atong dependent variable, so mo na siya si sales. Now, the variation for that which is changes depende sa amount of money or depende sa amount of effort you put, that will be the advertising expenditure. So this is your independent variable, and these are the formula for you to do that. Now, in cases of the above scenario, the equation can be modified as follows. So, mo na siya. So, sales is equals to beta coefficient. Again ha, ang coefficient is the number that is used to multiply the variable. Okay, so si B, mo ni siya si coefficient, plus B1 or the advertising budget plus the error 1, or this is representing a error that simply speaking accounts for all other factors that account variance in the dependent variables. So these are the used, or these are the legend of what this formula is all about. Again, this formula is involved only with two variables. So we have one independent variable and one dependent variable. Okay. And then there are some of the important terms when it comes to regression. Anyway, I'm not using this most of the time. I'm actually focusing more on the regression analysis, which involves dependent and independent variables. Maybe later on, we will be focusing on the two or more independent variable. So we have the regression coefficient, so measure of how strong each, also known as predictor variables, predicts the DB, or we called it dependent variable. DB, dependent variable. And then when we say independent variable, will be the I ID, or in the IDV. So R values, so this is actually relating to this, the result of the formula that you're going to use. We have the R values. So R values is actually a regression analysis that will provide you with different R values. So a simple R values represent the correlation between the observed values and the predicted values. Okay, and then the R square will be is used to find out how well the IVs are able to predict the DV. IV is actually the independent variable, and then the DV is the dependent variable. However, the R square values tends to be bit inflated when the number of independent variable is more, or when the number of cases is large. Again, independent variable or the IV, as long as it changes, it directly affect your DB. So this is the representation. Okay, so the next one is the multiple regression. Earlier, we are mostly focusing on the one dependent variable and one independent variable, which is the vi vi which is two vibrate regression. And then now we will further go to the multiple regression. So multiple regression is an extension of simple linear regression. So simple linear regression, or one to one, so this is actually the IV, the independent variable, and then the DB, the dependent variable. So it is directed only. So one independent variable directed to one DV, or one dependent variable. So whatever happens to your IV, it will directly affect what will happen to your DV, or the dependent variable. And then we also have the multiple regression, the many to one, the one that I have, some of the example that I give you earlier. It's actually relating to multiple regression. So when you say multiple regression, it is independent variable. We have four or more independent variable, and then one DV. So whatever happens with this multiple independent variable, it will directly affect what will happen to your DV, or your dependent variable. So that is the very easy explanation between what is the simple linear regression and the multiple regression, or the many to one, many independent variable to one dependent variable. The cause and the effect, but the many causes and then the effect. Okay, the new consideration. So, adding more independent variable, this is more emphasis on what is the difference between the two, the simple regression, the simple linear regression, and then the multiple regression. So, adding more independent variable to a multiple regression procedure does not mean that the regression will be better. Okay, so or offer better prediction. In fact, it can make things worse, and this is called overfitting. So these are some of the pros and cons when it comes to using the regression. And then we also have the addition of more independent variable creates more relationship among them. So meaning to say, DI, it doesn't mean that uh, the more independent variable that you get involved with your study, the better you get. It's not actually, because there are things that it can make your study even worse when you involve a lot of independent variable that is not actually relevant anymore in your study. So the addition of more independent variable creates more relationship among them, because you have to interconnect all the independent variable for you to be able to come up with the high accuracy nga effect or dependent variable. So only are the independent variables potentially related to the dependent variable. They are also potentially related to each other. When this happens, it is called multicollinearity. So kinahanglan when you have your study or when you propose a study, you have to make it sure that the independent variable will really have the relationship or the connection of whatever effect that you want to have in your study sa inyong dependent variable. And then before you have the independent variable, you have to make it sure that they are related with each other among all the independent variable that you are proposing in your study. Okay, so we also have the ideal is for all the ended variables to be correlated with the dependent variable but not with each other. Okay, so many relationships. So multiple regression is an extension of simple linear regression. Again, if you are asking about what is why are we talking about simple linear regression, and then why are we talking about bivalent regression? So multiple regression is an extension of simple linear regression because there are some of the studies that involve two types of relationship or two types of regression. And then when we say multiple regression or the many T1, the many IV to 1 DV is actually here. So some of it are actually extension of simple linear regression. So because there are some IV that actually releases an effect to the dependent variable independently. And then there are 10 relationships to consider. How come you have 10 relationships to consider? We have each IV or each independent variable are actually related to each other. If you can count, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are actually 10 relationships to consider. So there are 10 uh, there are 10 relationship or there are 10 correlations between each other. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay? So some independent variables or set of independent variables are better at predicting the DV than others. Some contribute nothing. So, katong earlier nga gidiscuss na that you have to make sure that all the independent variable that you are proposing or that you are making as variable of your study, make it sure that they are related to each other, but not totally. Is actually some studies could actually involve some independent variable, and then it actually better at creating or at giving the results or predicting a great or a great effect when it comes to our dependent variable, and some are not really others. So that's why we need to have a relationship, or we need to get a closer look of what are those independent variables that is greatly affect or that is contributed great when it comes to the effect of your study. So the ideal is for all the independent variable is to be correlated with the dependent variable but not with each other. Again, the ideal is for all the independent variable to be correlated with the dependent variable but not with each other. Meaning to say, you have to make sure that all the independent variables are correlated or are somewhat related with each other when it comes to the result or when it comes to the effect, but not really with each other. Let's say, for example, di ba I mentioned earlier about the variable, we have the age. When it comes to the uh, profile of, or the, we call it, I forgot, but it's more on the profile of a person or a profile of whatever survey you are making. So we have the age, the sex, the status, or the if it's married or divorced or whatever it is. So somehow they are correlated with each other, but they are actually not dependent with each other, because uh, they are murag matawag nato nga they have unique entity. So lahi-lahi sila. They have a separate entity, but they are actually somehow will result whatever effect you want to have with your study. So let's say, for example, if you want to have your study is if you want to predict the age of a person that is prone to get diabetic or diabetes, di ba? So you need to get the profile of a patient. So in order for you to get the profile of the patient, you really need to get how old is he or she, unsa iyang profile, babae ba siya, lalaki ba siya, unsa married ba siya, and then pila iyang edad, unsa iyang lifestyle. So those independent variable are actually correlated, but they are independent in somehow. So in order for you to get the dependent variable, you have to include all those independent variable that somehow correlate with each other. Okay? So we have multiple regression model. So because this will be the purpose of our study when it comes to regression model, so we are going to make a regression model. This will be just be quick and medyo taas-taas na ning video. So multiple regression model. So I will be discussing to you on a separate video. Okay, so we will be having we'll be making a multiple regression model that uses an Excel or Microsoft Excel. We're not I'm not gonna use, or I'm not gonna let you use the Rapid Minor or the MATLAB. What we're going to use is the one that is easily available for us. So that will be explained by with the next video that I'll be having. So multiple regression model. So this is what it looks, Monisha, and then I'll be discussing to you this by next meeting. Okay? So I hope somehow you are able to get at least what's the concept or what's the theory about regression and analysis, what's independent variable, what's dependent variable, and then what is variance, and then what is coefficient, and so many other things. What's the relationship or the difference or the distinct between the independent variable and the dependent variable, and what is the multiple regression, what is simple linear regression, and so many other things that we have discussed or that I have discussed in this video. I have whatever questions you have, please don't hesitate to message me, to PM me, so that at least I know from your perspective of what is the level of understanding you have when it comes to a regression, because regression is somehow most common method that some or the most of the students are actually making when it comes to their study. Okay, so thank you very much for watching this video. I hope that you are all well, and then